Hello everyone and welcome to this webinar organized by the European Disability Forum. I hope that everybody is well and I thank you very much for attending this webinar. Today we will be talking about the European Commission's new proposal for a multi-annual financial framework, which is to say a new EU budget. We will also be talking about their COVID-19 recovery package. We will be looking at how organizations at the national level can influence how this money is used and ensure sufficient investment for persons with disabilities. So before we begin today, I would like to share with you some logistical information and some housekeeping rules about how this webinar will work. The first thing I would like to mention is that you can find real-time captioning, the link to which is in the chat box. So the chat box should be located on the right of your screen. The webinar also has sign language interpretation. Now, for the first time today, we're going to be showing a video for one of our speakers, as the speaker isn't able to join us live. So I need to point out, if you need to continue seeing the sign language interpretation during the video, please do not put the video on full screen. This way you will be able to see the sign language interpreters throughout. All of the participants have muted microphones and EDF is controlling permission to unmute these. So don't worry if you were trying to unmute yourself and were unable, this is entirely normal. In case you face any technical issues, you can write to my colleague Raquel, and you can do this in the chat box as well. We are also inviting you to ask questions. So next to the chat box, there's a box called questions, and you can submit questions to any of the speakers at any time. We would just ask that you write the name of the speaker to whom you would like to ask the question. And then before we start, I want to thank our interpreters, first of all, Lisa and also Ferdinand, and also to our captioner, Kimberly. And of course, I want to thank all of the speakers for being with us and for all of you for joining us. Okay, so my name is Haydn Hammersley. I am the Social Policy Officer at EDF, and I will be your moderator today. I'm also going to begin by giving you a very quick introduction of the topic, just to have some context before we move on to all of the speakers. So if we can move to the next slide. Okay, just to explain a little bit the objectives of today. So I will begin by explaining about the new multi-annual financial framework, the new EU budget, and also explain a little bit what the EU's plan is for the COVID-19 recovery. I hope to do this very briefly. We will also be seeing some examples of how funds, the use of EU funds, can be influenced at national level. So we will have examples from Greece and from Spain. We will explore the impact funding can have on implementing the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, looking mostly at deinstitutionalization and also employment. And finally, we will understand a little bit more how the EU's plan for the COVID-19 recovery complements that being adopted by the UN. So if we move to the next slide. Just to briefly present the speakers who will be joining us today, we'll be joined by Yannis Vardakastanis, who is the President of the European Disability Forum. We will then have a video message from Maria Tusi Flores, who's from the OMTE Foundation. We will then be joined by Elizabeth Gosme, who is representing today the European Expert Group on the transition from institutional to community-based care, before going to Stefan Trömmel, who is from the International Labour Organization. And later on, we will be joined by a member of the European Parliament, Katrien Langensiepen, who is also one of the chairs of the Disability Intergroup in the Parliament. Okay, so we can go to the next slide. Okay, so the new budget proposed by the Commission, it was proposed on the 27th of May. And the main message to convey is that the entire budget has been strengthened by a 750 billion euro package, which is called Next Generation EU. So 500 billion of this is grants and 250 billion is made of loans. And this extra money is to be used exclusively for fighting the effects of the COVID-19 crisis. There have also been minor changes to the regulations. And next week, so on the 17th and 18th of July, there will be a special European Council meeting in Brussels, a summit, where they're aiming to reach an agreement on this new proposal. So if we can go to the next slide. Some positive things we've seen in the new proposal. So there is a proposal to add 30 billion euros to the Just Transition Fund. The Just Transition Fund is aimed to retrain workers from more polluting forms of employment, more polluting industries to greener forms of employment. And at EDF, we're hoping investment can also be made in training persons with disabilities to work in this new greener economy. There's also a proposal to boost the Neighbourhood Development and International Cooperation Instrument. It will get 10.5 billion euros of extra funding from Next Generation EU. We go to the next slide. We also see extra funds going towards a package called React EU, which MEP Catherine Langensiepen will talk to us about later. So this includes 55 billion euros of additional funds, and this will be made available for extra funding for the European Regional Development Fund, the European Social Fund, and the European Fund for Aid to the Most Deprived. So all of these are of interest to persons with disabilities. So we go to the next slide. There's also good news that the European semester will play an increasing role. Member states will be asked to draw up recovery and resilience plans as part of their national reform programs. And the extra importance of the semester gives organizations another opportunity to advocate for how the funds are used. If you want more information on the European semester, we have a dedicated page on EDF's website, and I can add the link to this later in the chat box. So we go to the next slide. There are also some reasons for concern. So we saw that the European Social Fund Plus, where we see a lot of investment for social inclusion of persons with disabilities, this has actually been reduced compared to what was previously proposed by the European Commission. And we also see a reduction in funds proposed for Erasmus Plus, which for young persons with disabilities is also a very important funding strand. We go to the next slide. At EDF, we've also been monitoring the fact that there will be quite a significant cut to the Rights, Values and Justice program. It will in fact be cut by 20%. And this program is important because it's a funding strand that goes towards financing civil society organizations, which at a time like this is something of quite a lot of concern. And unfortunately, there hasn't been any flexibility offered with regards to co-funding, for example, to counterbalance this reduction in money. We'll go to the next slide. So EDF, because of this, we've presented a resolution on the EU budget and the COVID-19 recovery. We're making a series of calls to EU policymakers, including ensuring that civil society organizations are not defunded during this period, to reject the proposal to reduce the money going towards the European Social Fund Plus, to invest in next generation EU money, so this extra money that's been proposed, in community-based services for persons with disabilities, to focus the Just Transition Fund on reaching and training workers with disabilities, and ensuring that increased external action spending respects the CRPD. So next slide. Okay, I'll now just talk very quickly because it will give context to what our next two speakers will say about how and when the funding is allocated. So for many of the programs, so the funding programs where investment can be made to furthering the rights of persons with disabilities, these come under shared management, which means essentially that most of the decisions for how the funds are used and where they go are taken at the national level. So next slide. And this is done through influencing the operational programs, which are detailed plans that the member state sets out to decide or to establish where exactly the money is spent during the next programming period. And importantly, and this is why we're having this discussion now, the process is currently underway and decisions are being made at the moment. So we can go to the next slide. And here on this slide, I'm showing a timeline, and the second line on my slide shows the periods in green during which decisions are made. This is showing that currently decisions on where the funds are going and how they will be used at the national level are being made from now until autumn this year. And then the same process will happen again in 2024. Okay, so this is a very quick overview, and without any further ado, I would like to hand over to our first speaker, Yannis Vardakastanis. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Haydn. Dear co-panelists, dear participants, this is another very important webinar on the EDF, which has to do with the future of the European Union, the new fundings that are being put in place to find a recovery and reconstruction of the Union, to meet hopefully the situation that has been created by the COVID-19 crisis, and to deal with the deficits, also the policies of the past have created in the member states. There is no question that we are in a new period of the history of the European Union. And in this period, we need to see and think very extensively and very thoroughly how we're going to position, both at the EU and at the member state level, the rights of persons with disabilities, those that we represent. And this is the period that our capacity to represent, meaning the capacity of our organizations to represent the 100 million Europeans with disabilities, will be tested by them and by society. And a real test of our work is how we're going to influence the instruments the European Union and the member states are going to put in place and use for this recovery and reconstruction period. Haydn has provided us with a very important package of information concerning the initiatives of the Union. What we need to do is both at the EU level, and EDF has been doing this. EDF has a long history of working with the European Commission, the Parliament and the Council and the other bodies of the European Union to influence and to have a real impact on the regulatory frameworks concerning the funds we're doing the same now for the new funds, for the next EU generation funding instruments, REACT, Europe, EU, etc. And of course, we know very well that the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted very seriously persons with disabilities. It has had a very strong impact on the services, on the jobs, on the medical treatment, on people who are in institutions, on persons with disabilities who are living alone at home. We are all aware, and we should never forget, in my opinion, that so many people have died only after the Second World War. And the majority of them have been older people and persons with disabilities living in institutions or alone at home. And this should be a guiding principle, a driving force of our work. We owe this to those who have paid with their lives the neglect and the ignorance of their governments, of the EU institutions, concerning putting in place real policies to protect the real conditions, the real living conditions of persons with disabilities of all citizens. And this is where we need to put our emphasis, our focus on. Now, I also have the responsibility today, in my capacity as President of the Greek Confederation of Persons with Disabilities, to provide you with some information how we have been doing here in Greece to influence, to have a real impact on the use of EU funds in Greece. We have been working in this field for 20 years, more than 20 years. At the end of the decade of the 90s, we were able to be accepted in the monitoring committees at the time as observers. But for the programming period 2000 to 2006, we managed to be accepted as full members with voting rights. And this has continued for 2007, 2013, 2014, 2020, and it will be the same for 2021, 2027. We need to understand something, and I say it up front, and I underline this. The issue is not technocratic. The issue is not technical. This is a real political issue. To be at the table, to be able to influence the decision-making process, you need to be considered as a partner to the government, equal partner to the other social partners, and to the other civil society organizations representing a big part of your society. And this is what we have managed here in Greece, to be accepted by all governments of all political parties that have governed Greece the last 25 years as the real social partners of the Greek state, representing persons with disabilities, persons with chronic diseases and their families. As I said, we are members in all monitoring committees of all operational programs directly or indirectly affecting persons with disabilities. The national sectorial operational programs and all regional operational programs. Each region in Greece, there are 13, runs a regional operational program. We are also members with voting rights in the operational programs of the cross-border programs with Albania, with Northern Macedonia, Bulgaria, and Cyprus. And also with the National Monitoring Committee governing the whole structural funds programming period. They are at all levels with voting rights. Also, since 2000, we have established in the relevant ministry, the Ministry of Development, a working group to operationalize the provisions of the regulatory framework, the general regulation and the regulation of the European Social Fund and the regulation of the European Regional Fund. And we have worked on the criteria, principles of accessibility and non-discrimination. In the current programming period, we have worked very intensively with the services at the ministry level, but also with the managing authorities to put in place all the necessary material and instruments for the implementation of the conditionalities. Now they are called enabling conditions. Now we are working for the enabling conditions for the period 21 to 27. We have been working for the specialization of the 5 objectives of the new programming period and for the finalization of the partnership agreement between Greece and the European Commission, which already, the draft that we have seen, already includes a very extensive list of issues concerning persons with disabilities. What I'm saying should not be considered as, like in Greece, you have reached the ideal status in this process. We have not. This is something we need to fight every day to achieve. Because as I said, the political issue. We use the results of the work of EDF and other partners of ours at the EU level in the regulatory framework. We use the CRPD at national level. We use the political might, allow me to use this term, of our organization in Greece and of the disability movement, and our determination not to be left behind, but not to accept to be left out, because this is what it's all about these days. So I think I have provided you with some information about Greece. Dimitris Logaras will continue following Haydn and colleagues this webinar. I really apologize, but I need to go to a meeting at the Ministry of Labour, and I need to leave you in a while. I will listen to some speakers, but then I will need to leave. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Yannis. And it was very good to have an insight into how the organizations in Greece are working to influence the use of funds. We're now going to go to Spain and have some tips from Maria Tusi Flores, who sent a video message talking about how, as Yannis has discussed with the case of Greece, the Spanish organizations are influencing EU funds in Spain. So I'll hand over to my colleague Raquel, who will show the video. Hello, everyone. So that was the end of the video. It got cut off a little bit at the end, but I think most of the message was clear. And we saw some similarities in the presentation by Yannis Vardakastanis and by Maria on tips for how to influence the use of funds at the national level. We saw things such as the importance of data collection, on justifying why you're arguing for certain things, being flexible and able to adapt to changing governments and to work with them in your member state, and so on. I just wanted to remind you again that if you want to send questions to any of the speakers, please feel free to write them in the question box. We've already received a few. And now we're going to move on to our next speaker to explore a little bit what difference the EU funds can make in furthering the rights of persons with disabilities, and to explain a little bit why at EDF we talk so much about the use of EU funds. So our next speaker is Elizabeth Cosme, who's speaking on behalf of the European Expert Group on the transition from institutional to community-based care. And as the name of the organization suggests, Elizabeth will be talking about the institutionalization and community-based care. So Elizabeth, I will hand over to you now.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Perfectly.
Great. Thanks for the invitation to the expert group. In a nutshell, you can see our logos here. It's quite a mix of organizations. Who are we? Well, we're an ad hoc expert group convened in 2009 by the then European Commissioner Spidla. Some of you will remember him. We're a broad coalition of stakeholders representing people with care or support needs and their families, including children, people with disabilities, homeless people, people experiencing mental health problems, as well as service providers, public authorities, and UN organizations. So we're also a kind of informal advisory body to the European institutions and member states. And you can find out more at the link here, deinstitutionalization.com. So on the 24th of April 2020, the EEG, we call it, for short, because it's quite a long title we have. Well, we called on 24th of April on EU leaders to ensure its response to COVID-19 takes into consideration persons living in institutions in Europe. Children, older people, persons experiencing homelessness, persons with disabilities and mental health problems who are segregated in short-term and long-term residential institutions are now more vulnerable than ever to human rights violations. They face increasing risks of infection, abuse, neglect, lack of care, health issues, mental distress, denial of medical treatment, and much more. More adequate funding to the social and care sector is needed, as well as support to families and carers. This can prevent an increase in institutionalization and prevent the worsening of the conditions of those who are living in residential segregated settings. So this is, in a nutshell, what we called for on the 24th of April, and I'd invite you to click on the link when you have the presentation after the webinar to see what we're calling for in more detail. In relation to today's topic, it was very interesting to hear about Greece and Spain, and I think they are very interesting good practices to follow, actually. When it comes to the potential of EU funds to support the DI shift, the deinstitutionalization shift, I'd like to highlight two pieces of legislation which are currently on the table today as part of the 2021-2027 EU budget negotiations. First of all, what we call the Common Provisions Regulation. This piece of regulation sets out a series of common general objectives and general principles for the budget, the future budget, such as partnership, multi-level governance, monitoring, evaluation, and much more. It covers most, if not all, the funds. I'm not sure, Haydn, you might know best, but it definitely covers key funds which are helpful to persons with disabilities and their families. It includes clear conditionalities as well for the use of the funding. Today, as Yannis said, they are called enabling conditions. And these are found in a number of parts of the Common Provisions Regulation, but I've highlighted Recital 17 and Article 11, which provide much more information. And by clicking on the link in the presentation, you'll see the legislation on the table in more detail. Now, these conditionalities attached to the funding have been quite helpful, I have to say, under this programming period, and we're hoping to continue that and reinforce that in the next programming period. We have a mix of conditionalities. We have horizontal conditionalities and we have thematic conditionalities on the table. For the horizontal conditionalities, you will see them in Annex 3 of this legislation. Two of them are highly relevant. Two conditions attached to use of the funds are, first of all, implementation of the Charter of Fundamental Rights. And secondly, the funds have to contribute to implementation application of the UN CRPD. This is a horizontal conditionality attached to the use of the funding in most funds. You'll see all the funds listed in the Common Provisions Regulation. This includes the European Social Fund, ERDF, so the European Regional Development Fund, the Cohesion Fund, the AMIF, and many more. There are also thematic conditionalities highlighted in this regulation, and you'll find these under Annex 4. And in that, you will see explicit references to the transition from institutional to community-based care, namely under the Social Europe priorities, the priorities aimed at implementing the European Pillar of Social Rights. The second piece of legislation I want to highlight, which again is on the table and currently being negotiated together with the European Parliament and the Council of Ministers, is the European Social Fund Plus. In Recital 28 and Article 6, you have explicit references to the fact that the European Social Fund should not in any way contribute to segregation or social exclusion. There is also Article 6, paragraph 2, that highlights that member states and the Commission have to support targeted actions in a number of areas, including the transition from residential and institutional care to family and community-based care. So there is very explicit reference to DI in both the Common Provisions Regulation and the European Social Fund Plus. Also interesting to note in the European Social Fund Plus are the annexes at the bottom of the regulation. Again, you have the direct link once you receive the presentation, and you can take a closer look. In the annexes, there are also indicators and target groups for the European Social Fund Plus, and there you will find a number of target groups, including persons with disabilities, homeless people, long-term unemployed, which concerns many family carers, of course, and third country nationals. So I'd invite you to go and look more specifically at the details of this proposal on the table. Of course, the next months will be crucial to make sure the original proposals of the Commission are kept and are strengthened even, but for that, the European Expert Group, of which EDF is also a member, will monitor this very closely. The enabling conditions, I mean, how relevant are they? How useful are they to drive the DI process, to move away from institutions? Well, what we note in the proposal for this new budgetary period is that there are fewer conditions, fewer conditionalities, fewer enabling conditions focused on the goals of the fund, and however, even if fewer, there is a call for better monitoring throughout the budgetary period. Member states will not be able to use the funds related to the specific objectives they choose until the enabling conditions are fulfilled. So they have to be fulfilled. For instance, under Social Europe, if the member states choose to focus on poverty and social exclusion, or gender equality, or health, they will have to have they will have to meet the enabling conditions first before using that. And this is to ensure that all co-financed operations are in line with the EU and international policy frameworks. And furthermore, these need to be maintained, so these enabling conditions need to be maintained throughout the implementation period, not just in 2021 or 2022. So the references to those are in the Common Provisions regulations, under Recital 17 and Article 11. But of course, they're referred to in other parts, but those are two central points. So the enabling conditions are really quite explicit and clear as regards the use of the funds for social objectives. But there is still a risk that institutions can be funded under non-social policy frameworks, like environment, for instance, energy efficiency, or under more digital agendas. So it's important to be vigilant and ensure institutions are not supported through other frameworks. For instance, are long-stay residential institutions targeted for energy efficiency or as part of digitalization and e-governance measures? This is a question. If you're on the monitoring committees, or if you have a foot in or get a foot in, these are questions to pose. In terms of the role of civil society, well, I think we've had two very interesting examples right now, just before, so on Greece and Spain, but it's not the case everywhere. Having said that, the Common Provisions regulation is quite clear and explicit about the role of civil society, which is explicitly mentioned under Article 6. And you have the article, or part of the article, in front of you here in my slide. Each member state shall organize a partnership with the competent regional and local authorities. That partnership shall include at least the following partners: urban and other public authorities, economic and social partners, and finally, relevant bodies representing civil society, environmental partners, and bodies responsible for promoting social inclusion, fundamental rights, rights of persons with disabilities, gender equality, and non-discrimination. So this is an explicit request and is regulated under a 2014 piece of legislation, which provides a very clear European Code of Conduct on partnership. Now, we as an expert group publish different documents, different joint statements, but in preparation of this funding period, this new upcoming funding period, and the preparation of the partnership agreements, we published a checklist to ensure that the EU funds for 2021 to 2027, to ensure that they contribute to independent living and inclusion in the community. More specifically, the checklist supports monitoring of consistency of the measures with the legal and policy frameworks in the fields of transition from institutional to family-based and community-based services, development of quality family-based and community-based services, prevention of separation of children, including with disabilities, from their families, and prevention of segregation and institutionalization of children, persons with disabilities, persons with mental health problems, older persons, and homeless people, regardless of their residence status. Now, I would invite you to go and click on the link when you receive the presentation to see the checklist in detail. It's extremely helpful. Last slide is really basically, I guess, emphasizing what has already been said by our Greek and Spanish colleagues. The EU budget negotiations are still ongoing at Brussels level, but in parallel, also, we have the preparation of the partnership agreements, some in fairly final stages. And so it's kind of now or never to contact your ESF or indeed ERDF authorities. But here you have the link directly to the contact points for the ESF authorities. And here we would recommend you do the following: that you contact them, that you provide them with any kind of data you have on the DI needs in your community, that you ask to be part of the regional national dialogue on implementation of the ESF Plus and indeed other funds in line with the UNCRPD and the partnership principle I highlighted earlier. That you use the EEG checklist to assess if the policy objectives in the partnership agreements are directed at independent living, to assess what the target groups are, to ensure the funding of a range of services in the community, and to really identify any unwelcome measures. And finally, I would really encourage you to mention the work of your umbrella organizations, whether this is EDF or indeed others, because they provide a lot of information. They also provide lots of exchange on what's happening in other countries and showing what is happening in other countries, indeed good practices like involvement and even voting rights in the Greek monitoring committees, I think is very, very useful to mention as examples. So that's it really, and I'd be very happy to answer any questions, and you'll find much more information about our work on our website, and that's it really. Thank you, Haydn.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. As you mentioned, the participants can submit questions in the questions box, so please don't forget to do that if you have a question of any kind, and just remember, of course, to write to whom you would like to ask your question. So yeah, thank you very much for that presentation. I think it's really important that we've been given an example of what we mean when we talk about investment in the social inclusion of persons with disabilities with this really concrete example. It's good to have this overview of the advocacy that's being done at the EU level to give the national organizations the best chance of ensuring that the funds go to the right place. And of course, I mean, it's good to see in your overview clearly what is allowed to be funded by EU funds and what is not, so that the national organizations have a clear understanding of when funds are being misused and not. So beyond the institutionalization, another considerable goal in the use of EU funds is that of fostering inclusion in the open labour market for persons with disabilities. And we're joined by Stefan Trömmel, who's from the International Labour Organization, to discuss this a little bit more. And the ILO has also been working on the UN response to COVID-19 crisis. So we will hear a little bit more about how this compares to the EU response and what we can look out for there. So Stefan, I will hand over to you.
Yes, Haydn, thank you, and thank you to EDF for the invitation to take part in this important webinar. As you were saying, I will not focus on EU issues, although I think I will explore the complementarity between the European Union and the UN. I will focus on employment and social protection issues, and I will definitely focus on the impact of the COVID-19 crisis. In fact, I was just listening right now to the second day of the ILO Global Summit on COVID-19, and today is the meeting where we have a lot of speeches from heads of states. We had Angela Merkel before. We have just listening now to the President of Portugal. We had messages from IMF, from the World Bank, from the World Trade Organization, and so a full day of messages. And if you ask me how many of those messages have mentioned persons with disabilities, well, so far, unless I missed any, none of those messages have addressed the situation of persons with disabilities, which is not so much a surprise, but of course it's still a concern. Because as many of you have said, Yannis started with that, it's clear that the COVID-19 is having a significant impact on the situation of persons with disabilities. We know about all the stories in terms of people with disabilities living in institutions and at home, the high mortality rate. But I will focus more on, important as that is, and of course it has been and should, and rightly so, it has been the first priority. I would also like to say that when disability NGOs have asked people with disabilities, especially in a developing country context, about their main concern related to the pandemic, it has been much more the economic impact than the actual risk of being infected. And especially in countries where there's no social protection system, where people have lost their jobs, have lost their livelihoods, their income. It's normal that people with disabilities are much more concerned about bringing food to the table than actually being infected by the virus. And we had a webinar with the EDF counterpart in Latin America, Riadis, and that was a very strong message coming from the Latin American region. Help us to keep the jobs that people with disabilities already have, even sometimes that they are not the best jobs in the world, but let's make all the efforts to keep those jobs, because we all know that once people with disabilities lose their jobs, it's so difficult to get back in. We have done webinars with the private sector, and I think the big issue that we have discussed with companies that are committed to disability inclusion, and we have a number of those, and we coordinated the global network of companies committed to disability inclusion. The big question mark for all of us is really, will the way out of the crisis, will it be a disability inclusive way, or will it be a way in which we sort of go back in time and we will lose all the little progress, but still progress that has been made over the last years also in terms of employment in the open labor market, as Haydn was referring to. Are we going to build on that, or are we going to lose some of that, much of that progress? So for us, the way we have phrased it in the ILO and also in the context of the wider United Nations is we need to promote a disability inclusive response to the COVID-19 crisis. And as Haydn, as you mentioned, the ILO has been very actively collaborating with other United Nations entities on that. And we have been benefiting from the fact that now within the United Nations system, there is a common United Nations disability inclusion strategy, a common accountability framework. And this year, in fact, has been the first year in which every UN entity, and there are many of those, have been reporting on how we are including persons with disabilities throughout our work. And because of COVID-19, we included a specific section where we were all being asked to explain how we were including persons with disabilities in the overarching response of our entities to the COVID-19 pandemic. In fact, today a very important meeting is happening. Every week the UN organizes a meeting with the top UN officials in each country. We call them the resident coordinators. They're like the official counterpart of the UN with the government. And there's a meeting every week on the COVID-19 response. And today a specific section of that meeting will be devoted to conveying a message coming from the very top of the United Nations to remind these resident coordinators, as they are called, that they need to take the lead in terms of promoting disability inclusion in the different elements of the response to the crisis, in the health response, of course, in the humanitarian response in those countries where COVID-19 is also has appeared in a context where there have been already pre-existing humanitarian situations, but also in the socio-economic response, which is the area in which the ILO has a sort of more of a mandate and of an experience. We have been working together with other UN entities on checklists. Previous speaker has spoken about a checklist in the EU context. We have done something similar, basically trying to identify what are the issues that the UN entities working in a specific country, as well as our country counterparts, what needs to be done to ensure that this response, these national response plans that are currently being designed, and how to make those disability inclusive. Of course, it is about involving disability organizations in the design of those, very much similar to some of the examples we've heard from Spain and Greece, but also in a context in many developing countries where disability organizations are not as strong as in some of the European countries. It's of course about data disaggregation. We need to make sure that data are disaggregated by disability. And of course, it's also about combining mainstream initiatives, so disability inclusion in mainstream initiative, as well as providing support to disability-specific initiatives where relevant. We must admit that we are concerned. I mean, we have done, the ILO has taken a lead on analyzing 40 country assessments that have been done as a first step towards the design of these socio-economic responses. And only 4 of the 40 countries included in a meaningful way persons with disabilities, both in the analysis of the situation and in the actual recommendations. And these assessments have been the first step towards the planning of the response. And of course, we are concerned because if people with disabilities are not adequately being included in the initial assessment, there's a risk that in the actual design of the response, also people with disabilities are not mentioned. Funding plays a key role in all this. So we have also been discussing with other UN entities how to influence the different funding streams that are being used now for COVID-19. There have been new funds that have been created. We've heard about an EU fund for the EU context, but we also need to really see how, and I think that is where some of the elements come together of combining the EU and the UN work is, as you all know, the EU is the largest international cooperation donor and has committed to the use of the disability marker in the OECD context. So we need to make sure that also the EU, in the funding that the EU is giving through its external action work towards the response to the COVID-19 pandemic in a developing country context, we need to make sure that that funding includes requirements to make sure that the funding also addresses the situation of persons with disabilities. So that is a very clear example of how the EU external action and the work of the UN need to support each other. We have a feeling that very often there is a disconnect there. There's not always a close collaboration between the UN field presence and the European Union delegations in the field of the EU sometimes, as well as of EU member states when they have a significant presence. And I think it's we as disability organizations, and we need EDF for that, we need to make that plea that there needs to be, especially in the current context of the COVID-19 response, we need that closer collaboration between the EU external action and the activities of the UN. What are the type of measures that we are proposing? And I think it's fair to say that so far it has been easier for all of us to think about the measures that are needed in the most immediate sort of confinement lockdown situation. It has been about telework. We have been on webinars around how to make telework accessible for people with disabilities. It is about occupational health and safety measures. It's of course about providing workplace adjustments also for people with disabilities when working at home. It is about non-discrimination in the gradual return to the work premises, and of course ensuring that the work premises are adequately safe for everybody, in particular also for workers with disabilities. Where we have been struggling a bit more has been in terms of defining our narrative in what we call the socioeconomic recovery. How do we ensure that in these huge investments that our governments are making to reactivate the demand side, to support companies, to support those sectors that have been particularly hit by the COVID-19 crisis, the tourism sector and other sectors, what exactly can we propose there for these measures to be disability inclusive? And just listening today to the mainstream messages and initiatives that are being taken, some issues clearly stick out and are particularly relevant for us. One is about skills. There is a clear need for people to be reskilled or upskilled, people that are losing their jobs and will no longer be able to go back to the jobs they had. We need to make sure that these skills development efforts made by our countries are inclusive of persons with disabilities. Social protection, there's a clear acknowledgement that the current social protection system, also in the EU, but in particular also in the developing country context, has not been up to the job. But we have seen how in many countries, and also heard from European Union countries, how the social protection schemes have been used to bring cash to those families, those households that have been particularly hit by the crisis, and that has included households with persons with disabilities. For instance, in the context, especially in the developing country context, where people have not been people especially have been sort of more in the informal economy, have not had a proper labor market labor relationship with with the public or the private sector. We have seen many examples of the social protection benefits directly helping people with disabilities in these extreme situations. We've heard a lot in our discussions today in the ILO, right, and logically so, about the role of social dialogue. But I would like to link that with the comments made by Yannis at the beginning of this recognition in the Greek context of the Greek Confederation as a social partner, as an element, as a key player in that social dialogue. I'm aware that is a rather unique situation, but I think in a context where much of the way out of the crisis will require coalitions, negotiation, discussion, and agreement between government, employers, and trade unions, we need all together to find ways to get the disability concerns into these discussions. Sometimes by sitting also at the table, that's the Greek situation, sometimes at least by ensuring that whoever is sitting at that table has been advocated by us to represent our issues, and that sometimes can come from the government, it can come from employer federation, and of course it also should come from trade unions. But I think we need to find ways to be a part of these important discussions. Of course, it is about ensuring disability inclusion in the measure that we directly create jobs, whether it's in support of specific sectors, whether it's in terms of strengthening the role of public employment services. I've mentioned already the vocational training. We need to make sure that the job mediation schemes that exist, specifically also for persons with disabilities, like we have in many countries, that they continue to get the adequate support. Because one major concern, and I've heard that also from more developed countries, is that the reallocation of budgets to the COVID-19 crisis, not only is that budget very often not inclusive of persons with disabilities, but it has also meant a reduction in the funding that has gone until then to disability-specific initiatives, for instance, in the context of job mediation, of personal assistance schemes where they exist, but also in the provision of assistive technologies, without which persons with disabilities not only cannot find or keep their work, but also will have many other barriers to their full participation in societies. I'm coming to an end. We had a meeting last November, about the future of work and how to make the future of work inclusive of persons with disabilities. It is interesting to see how the main recommendations coming from that report are even more relevant in the current post-COVID-19 context. No? We've heard a lot today in the meeting I was listening in about the role of digital economy, digitalization. We need to make sure that people with disabilities are part of the investments that build the skills, these digital skills, in order for people with disabilities to be able to take their full part in these digital jobs that are being created. We all hear about now that the way out of the crisis, this building back better that we use, this new normal that we are speaking about, needs to be also a much more environmentally friendly way out. This concept of just transition, or the transition from a carbon intensive to a low carbon economy, the new jobs that will be created, and we call them sometimes green jobs in the context of the ILO. We need to make sure that the investments that our governments are making to promote these industries, these jobs in that context, to make sure that people with disabilities get their fair share from these initiatives. Haydn, I leave it there, and happy to come in the final part on question and answers if we get any questions to me. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Stefan. I can also point out that EDF this year will be writing a big report on COVID-19, and employment is going to be one of the sections we focus on a lot. So you can definitely expect to see more information on that. And thank you very much for all of the information you gave us, Stefan. Okay, so we've heard some tips from national disability organizations about how to influence where the EU funds go. We've heard about the importance of EU funds being used to bring people out of institutions. We've heard about employment. Now for our final speaker, we are going to go full circle and come back to one of the things I mentioned in my introduction, which is the React EU which is an extra 55 billion euros being proposed to go towards the regional development funds, the social fund, European social funds, and the European Fund for Aid to the Most Deprived. And we're very fortunate to be joined by a member of the European Parliament, Ms. Katrien Langensiepen, who is also one of the chairs of the Disability Intergroup, and who is working as part of a European Parliament report on React EU. So Katrien is with us today to explain a little bit more, and without any further ado, I will hand over to you, Katrien, if you can hear us. Yes, I can see you.
Can you hear me?
Perfectly.
Perfect. Okay, yeah. So, yeah, dear friends and dear colleagues, first of all, yeah, thanks for inviting me, and I apologize for being here for only a couple of minutes, but even if only for a short time, I found it important to inform you about my work on the React EU file. As you all know, React EU is a new instrument for crisis response and crisis repair delivered through simplified and highly flexible cohesion policy. For example, CR2 and CR2+. With a budget of already mentioned 55 billion euros for the years of 2020, 2021 and 2022. For those geographic areas where support is most needed. The financial support will be challenged through ERDF, that means the European Regional Development Fund, and the ESF, European Social Fund, partly the FEAD, the Fund for the Most Deprived. The ERDF support will be dedicated to, among others, for products and services for health services and productive investment in SMEs, including operational and personal costs and health safety measures. The ESF support is meant for job maintenance, short-time work schemes, and support to self-employed or job creation, youth employment measures, skills, and access to social service of general interest. There's a new cross-cutting thematic objective, fostering crisis repair in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic and repairing a green, digital, and resilient recovery of the economy. The lead committee on the file is a REGI committee. I'm working on the file as the Greens EFA, or for the Greens EFA, as a shadow in the Employment and Social Affairs Committee, and my amendments demand, for example, the fund can also be spent on poverty eradication and social inclusion measures. I ask for that the data on the basis of which the allocation of the funds will be determined will also include data on the most deprived, such as homeless people, for example, or persons with disabilities living in segregated institutions, who are traditionally not reached by member states and the statistical officers, what a huge problem is. Further, I ask for that the short-term work schemes founded by React EU will provide a living income above the poverty threshold, and that the supported healthcare services and social services will be universal, accessible, and of high quality. Then that React EU should not support any action that contributes to segregation or to social exclusion, that the gender aspects have to be taken into account in all the programs, in all stages, that social partners and the civil society, including NGOs working on poverty and social inclusion, non-discrimination and gender equality are involved in all stages of the program. Nothing about us without us. And that REACT-EU has to ensure non-discrimination on all the bases listed in the Charter of Fundamental Rights. Sex, for example, sex, race, color, ethnic or social origin, genetic features, languages, religion or belief, political or any other opinion, membership of a national minority, poverty, birth, disability, age, or sexual orientation. We will have our shadow meeting next week, so I will keep you updated, and the vote will take place after the summer break in September. So that's a short run through the REACT-EU file, and yeah, I will inform you as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And yeah, we look forward to being updated. We had a question for you, but in fact, you answered it already. It was on what disability-specific things we can expect to see in the report. So, yeah, but I think you were very specific in your presentation, and this has already been answered. Regarding questions then for the speakers, there was a question for Yannis Vardakastanis, which we've taken note of. My colleague has informed me that Yannis has left the meeting, unfortunately, so he won't be able to take that question now. The question was about institutions in Greece. We will make sure that his office gets this question, and we will forward this answer on to you. So don't worry, that question will be addressed. We have a question for Stefan, if you're happy to answer. The question is whether there are some lessons that the EU can learn from the UN in its response to the COVID-19 crisis. Stefan, would you be happy to answer this question?
Yes, well, it's not an easy one. I think we're all in a learning curve right now. No, I think nobody has the answer. But I think what is important is that what I tried to say before. No? I think there's a need for more complementarity between the EU and the UN. It was interesting to listen to the summit today, and because we had, as I said, we had a lot of speakers from EU countries. We also had a lot of speakers from other countries, and to some extent the messages were similar. I think the challenges are similar. So I think that we need to find this place for that collaboration, and I think hopefully disability inclusion can be one of these elements that will bring together. So I'm not sure. I think there are specific examples from countries that can be used in both ways. I'm aware that EDF has been looking, for instance, in some examples that we have shared as ILO on how social protection in some countries has been used quite immediately to address the situation of persons with disabilities, in terms, for instance, of countries that already had a disability benefit, how they expanded the coverage to people with disabilities that perhaps were not covered yet, how some changed and paid some of the benefits in advance, how some of the delivery mechanisms were changed to protect people from infection. And I think there were examples there which came also from EU countries, but also from developing countries. So I think there's definitely lessons that can be learned in both ways. I would also argue that the fact that we have within the UN system, that we have this new accountability framework that makes us all as UN entities have to report on how we're including persons with disabilities in our work, and that's a pre-COVID-19 framework, but it just come into place. I think it has put us in a situation which is much better than without that. We also have, thanks to that, we have a very good access to the very top level of the UN in terms of having the Secretary General of the UN conveying a message, sending out a video to make it clear to everybody that the response needs to be disability inclusive. Can we relax on that? Is that enough? No, it's definitely not enough. No? But I think there are a couple of elements there in terms of this very recent United Nations architecture that I think some of those elements could be also useful in order to ensure an even more significant mainstream of disability inclusion throughout the EU system. And I think that would also be particularly relevant in the current context. Now, but as I said before, I think for me, I would like to reiterate that message, because I really need EDF to help us to reach out to the EU offices in the field and to bring them together with the United Nations field offices and, for instance, World Bank, which is another entity that's a bit separate. We need all of these colleagues in the developing country context to work together and leverage each other, also in terms of the funds. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stefan. We had some questions for MEP Langenziepen, who unfortunately also had to leave us because she has another meeting now. One of them was on if there are any proposals for better monitoring React EU investments, given the problems with monitoring during the COVID pandemic. We will direct this question to her office and try to get a response for you. There was also a question asked, can researchers use these funds to complete PhDs and research that looks at the issues of employment and social inclusion for persons with disabilities? If we're talking, I mean, I can answer this very briefly. If we talk about this extra funding in Next Generation EU and React EU, my understanding is that these are really to be used directly as a response to the pandemic and to help businesses and service providers recover. But for such research, it would be more likely to come from Horizon Europe funding to invest in research. So I think it would be more worthwhile to kind of explore this if this is what you're interested in. And then, unless I'm mistaken, we can have one final question for Elizabeth, which I think is also quite a difficult question. So for Elizabeth, it's a big question. Have we seen an improvement in people being moved out of institutions in recent years? And what, in your opinion, are the major barriers to this that remain? It's a big question, Elizabeth, so good luck.
A big one, thank you. Who asked that question? I want to know. Yes, look, well, recently we supported a stock taking of the situation and published the report, I think just a couple of weeks ago, which gives some insight into how far we've come, and I'd invite you to go and check that. It's nuanced, it's pretty nuanced, and you know, there's different trends in different countries, some positive, some negative, but overall we still have a very long way to go. So definitely the funds have helped, they've helped in many ways, but barriers still persist. Barriers are on many levels, but there are a lack of strategies to achieve DI, so clear policy visions, policy objectives. For now, there's pockets of experimentation, thanks to the structural funds, of course, but there's still a lack of regional and national strategies to actually deliver the shift. Then, of course, the funding models persist in this continuous institutionalization language, funding beds instead of funding inclusion pathways, for instance. So there are barriers on the funding discourse as well that need to be addressed. There's also a general shift in thinking on, is DI possible or not? Barriers to DI exist, but they're not insurmountable at all. In fact, with the political will and the funding, it is clear that DI is just a matter of time. So we're there to continue monitoring the process, both at European and national level through our different national members, and really keeping our eye on the objective, the vision to be achieved. But put it this way, we're making huge progress, even if sometimes we have setbacks. We have setbacks and we need to deal with these. Institutions still exist, and the research report of the Commission that was published just a couple of weeks ago shows this. So I think we have to be realistic, understand that it will take maybe some time for shifts in service provision, shifts in policy and funding models, but we need to keep our eye on the objective. And the more we are working together collectively to achieve that vision, which is driven by the UNCRPD, Article 19 on independent living, the sooner we'll get there. So I don't know if that's a real answer to your question, but yes, of course, institutions still exist, but we're making progress, and it has to be seen. We have to be optimistic in that sense that we are slowly but surely achieving our vision, and the EU funds are contributing to this.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. I think you did a good job of answering the question. I think we could have an entire webinar on that topic, and perhaps one day we should indeed think about doing that. It's a huge topic, so thank you very much.
But if you allow me, I'll add the link to the research report to be circulated to the participants, if that's okay.
Perfect. We can add that then on our website. We're recording this, and we will make the recording eventually available on the EDF website. So we'll put all the links up there. Okay, and so with that, I think we can bring the webinar to a close. So I would like to begin by firstly thanking all of the speakers for taking the time to be with us, for sharing your expertise with us, giving us all of your tips. And for making it such an interesting webinar. I apologize to the people who asked questions that we weren't able to respond to live, but I promise you that we will pass on those questions and try to get a response to you as quickly as we can. I would also like to thank our sign language interpreters, Ferdinand, who we can see at the moment, and Lisa. I would also like to thank Kimberly, who's been doing the live captioning for us. I would like to thank my colleagues Raquel and Eleni for helping out with the logistics. And of course, I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today. So all that's left is to wish you a very pleasant afternoon for what remains of it, and hopefully to have a very lovely summer. So thank you for joining us, and goodbye.